Hi folks, welcome to the Ramble. Something wonderful happened in this country of mine, the United States, over the weekend. There was a nationwide demonstration led primarily by young people, by high school students, including students who were themselves survivors of school shootings, to protest in favor of new gun laws, gun reform, gun control here in the United States, something that we have needed desperately for a very, very long time. It was an inspiring, wonderful thing. Hundreds of thousands of people filled the streets of Washington, D.C. and other cities all around the country to push for gun control in the United States. And it was inspiring and encouraging and just a really terrific thing. The largest student-led protest since the Vietnam War. And I said that previously when I was referring to the walkouts, the school walkouts a couple weeks ago. And that has, of course, been superseded now by the anti-gun marches on Saturday. It's just a tremendous thing to see, and it makes me very happy and fills me with a lot of hope for on an issue that, as I have expressed to you many times in videos in the past, is an issue that I don't often have a lot of hope with. I often despair that we will never truly solve our gun problem in the United States because there are so many of us that don't want to solve it, that don't see it as a problem to begin with. But Saturday was a good day. Saturday was a good day to see that maybe there is a spark of hope. Maybe there is a seed that will sprout real change in this country on the gun issue. I hope that's the case. But my admiration for those people, especially those young people, and my hope that perhaps the tide is beginning to turn is tempered by the fact that all of this is even necessary to begin with. And I in my joy and in my optimism, I can't help but also be reminded of how dire the actual situation is to require this kind of response to begin with. In 1996 in Australia, there was a horrible mass shooting where 35 people were killed. It was called the Port Charles shooting because it occurred at Port Charles in Tasmania, and 35 people were killed. It was the deadliest mass shooting in the history of Australia. And the aftermath of that, the result was that the Australians rallied and changed their gun laws. And we've heard this story many times. John Oliver was the first to bring it to fresh American attention after the Sandy Hook massacre. I remember it being news in this country at the time that it happened, but it didn't remain a part of our national consciousness. And we were then reminded of it after Sandy Hook, and it has become a common talking point in the United States since then. Look at what Australia did after they had a horrible mass shooting. Why can't we do that? And in the years since the Port Charles shooting, 770 people have died in the United States in mass shootings. And those numbers come from a Washington Post article on the subject that was published a little while ago and has been updated in the time since, that chronicles mass shootings in the United States since about 1966. And it counts 150 incidents. And the definition that is used for this article is an incident where 4 or more people were killed. And that is not the definition that every source uses. The mass shooting tracker website, I believe, doesn't count deaths, counts number of people shot. So it would include incidents where 4 or more people are shot, regardless of who was killed, in its count of mass shootings. But that is not the tally, that is not the criteria that this Washington Post article uses. It goes by incidents where 4 or more people were killed. And according to the data published in this Washington Post article, 770 Americans have died in mass shooting events since the Port Charles massacre in late April 1996 in Australia. So that is the equivalent, in number of deaths, that is the equivalent of 22 Port Charles massacres having occurred in the United States since the Port Charles massacre itself occurred in Australia. One Port Charles massacre in Australia was enough to shake that culture, to convince enough people in that country that something major had to be done, that they had to implement real serious change. After one Port Charles massacre, and they overhauled their gun laws, they implemented new restrictions, they implemented buyback programs, amnesty programs where people who have unregistered firearms that they're not supposed to have can turn them in for no penalty and the guns are then destroyed. All kinds of programs that we should be doing in this country that I strenuously, stridently support. One Port Charles massacre was all it took for Australia to implement those changes. And since those new gun laws have gone into effect, which was later in 1996, there have been 2 mass shooting events in Australia, according to Wikipedia. The total number of deaths in those events is 7. So 7 people have died in Australia since the Port Charles massacre. 770 people have died in mass shootings in the United States since the Port Charles massacre occurred in Australia. 22 Port Charles massacres. And we still are just now to the point where we're starting to consider maybe getting some gun control on the books. But I don't want to give you the impression that Americans are not responding to the gun violence problem, or particularly the mass shooting problem that we have here that is unique throughout the economically developed world, because we actually do have some very innovative solutions. And I wanted to actually spend the rest of this video telling you about one of the most innovative solutions to mass shootings, and particularly to school shootings, that I have seen. It's from a school district in Schuylkill County, Pennsylvania. And this school district has begun arming its students with rocks in case of a shooting. This is from a story on CNN by Nicole Shives. Buckets full of river stones have been placed in all classrooms at the Blue Mountain School District in Schuylkill County. Superintendent David Helsel said, if students at the rural school can't evacuate during a shooting, they don't have to sit and wait. Protocol has been that students lie down under desks and basically become passive targets in our classrooms, Helsel said. We decided to empower our students with tools of self-defense if needed. Look, I don't blame this superintendent. I don't blame this school district or these teachers or any of these people for any of this. But Jesus Christ, if you want one story to serve as a microcosm of how warped this country's priorities have become, and of how deep in the shit we are in terms of gun violence and mass shootings and school shootings in particular in this country. Read this story. Look at this story where a superintendent of schools has resorted to putting buckets of rocks in classrooms so that if there is a school shooter, at least the students can throw rocks at him. That's the level that we're at. That's how bad things are. And that's how hopeless the gun reform cause seems to many people. Well, we're not going to fix the underlying problem. We're not going to do anything about the guns, which is the cause of everything. The permissive attitude toward gun ownership, the sheer number, the prevalence of guns in this country, the fact that pretty much anybody at any time who wants to get their hands on a gun, legally or illegally, can do it without too much trouble in the United States. We're never going to even seriously attempt to address that problem, apparently. Although hopefully the people who marched on Washington and across the country on Saturday will have something to say about that. But the attitude being, well, we're never going to solve that problem, or at least we can't count on that problem being solved anytime soon. So let's make sure that the kids all have rocks that they can throw at the shooter. Well, shit, why not give them rocks to throw? I mean, it's better than having them lay there and wait to get shot, because it is inevitable that eventually someone is going to come in and shoot at them. That's just the country we live in. Let's just treat that as though it's a natural state. Well, there's nothing you can do about that. I mean, people have guns. I mean, eventually one of them is going to snap and try to kill some people. Like, that's just the way it is. That's just part of nature. That's a condition that was apparently set during the Big Bang. I can't do anything about the guns. So might as well give the kid some rocks to throw at the shooter when he inevitably shows up. We are a country of deferential cowards, and we are deferring to gun fetishists who, when a horrible mass shooting like the Parkland shooting takes place, their reaction is not horror and grief and heartbreak at the loss of life, or anger at the circumstances that enabled that to happen so easily. No, that's not their reaction. Their reaction is to grab their favorite gun and hug it tight and say, nobody's ever going to take you away from me. Those liberals, and now those kids, those mouthy kids, oh, they're not going to take my guns away from me. That's their priority. Better I get to keep my guns and retain the ability to easily purchase more guns should I desire. Better that. Let's maintain that status quo than make any sort of changes that would make it more difficult for incidents like the Parkland shooting or the Sandy Hook shooting to happen in the future. Now, as I said, hopefully Saturday is a sign of things to come. Hopefully Saturday and the demonstrations that took place around this country will in the future be looked back upon as one of the great significant milestones in the change that is to come. Hopefully we will look at those Parkland school shooting survivors, at those kids, and we will be able to credit them for leading the way, for leading the charge, for bringing about long overdue change to our absolutely ridiculous, irrational gun laws that are built around the assumption that anybody who wants a gun should be able to have one, and even if the price of that is 770 people killed in mass shootings in just over 20 years, even if the cost of that is between 30 and 40,000 people dying gun-related deaths in the United States every year, hey, what are you going to do? Not let people have guns? That is the mentality. That is the mentality. And when you look at the justifications that people resort to, when you say, well, why not just give up the guns? Why do you need so many guns? Why do most private citizens need guns in their home at all? In many cases, the responses you get are, well, because you need to have an armed populace to keep the government at bay. Keep the government from encroaching on people's rights. You need to have an armed populace so that the government it knows that it has to respect the privacy and the will of the people. So our gun laws are now being determined by the paranoia of some gun fetishists. We lie to ourselves, we flatter ourselves, and we say that it's vigilance. It's vigilance. We just want to remain vigilant and prepared should the government ever really overstep its bounds and try to infringe on the rights of the people. We call it vigilance, but that's not what it is. It's paranoia. It's fear and paranoia. We are a fearful, cowardly, paranoid people. And we cling to our guns, even at the cost of each other's lives. Because we're too frightened, we're too pissing in our pants frightened of our imaginary fears to let go of the guns, even after the equivalent of 22 Port Charles massacres since the actual Port Charles massacre. And because of that, because that is how it's almost certainly going to happen, even when the reforms are in place, even when the gun laws have been changed, even when the United States, after probably years or decades, because there are so goddamn many guns out there that even if the laws are changed, it will still take quite some time, probably a generation or two, before the problem itself is actually under control. But even after that is done, this period in our history will always be something that future generations should be ashamed of. We will always have to live with the fact that in the United States, for a period of 2 or 3 decades, we lived in a country where there were dozens of mass shootings every year, a phenomenon that had no parallel anywhere else in the economic developed world. We were the only major economically developed nation in the world that had this problem, where hundreds of our people were gunned down in mass shootings, and where tens of thousands were gunned down or died of gun-related deaths in general every single year. Homicides, suicides, accidental deaths. Tens of thousands of people died from gun-related causes every year, and for decades, we did nothing. We allowed gun fetishists, the pro-gun lobby, the NRA, to write our gun laws and to completely ignore this problem. That will be a shame and a stain on the history of this country forever. We can add that to the list, alongside the genocide of Native Americans, alongside slavery, alongside the subjugation of non-white people, the subjugation of women, the subjugation and mistreatment and dehumanization of gay people and trans people and immigrants and all the other groups of people that we have treated as less than human over the years. Inequalities in the criminal justice system, the prison system, political corruption, all of these stains on the soul of this nation, and our utter indifference to our gun violence problem for decades will always be a stain on the history of this nation. We will always have to live with the fact that we had this happening every day in our country for decades, and we did nothing. And in fact, it took teenagers who themselves were survivors of such a shooting to shake us all, to wake us up, and to force us into action. And to finally give enough people the courage to tell the NRA to go fuck itself before real change was realized. That's how out of control that we and our politicians, our leaders, our elected representatives, that's how out of control the problem has been allowed to grow. So much so that even when we solve it, it will always be a cause of shame. It's something I'm always going to be ashamed of. I'll be ashamed of it. I will be incredibly proud if and when real serious gun control reforms are passed, if and when there are real federal gun laws passed in this country, equivalent to those enacted in Australia after the Port Charles massacre. If and when that happens, believe me, I will be incredibly proud. I will be beaming that day. But I will always be ashamed that it took this long for it to happen. And I can't imagine a time, even in that wonderful, fantastic future that I am envisioning, where there are sensible federal gun laws in the United States. Even in that wonderful future, I can't imagine a time when I don't, at least occasionally, look back on this story. School district arming students with rocks in case of a shooter. And think to myself, what the hell was wrong with us?